Luna's breath fogged the glass as she traced the outline of the impossible mansion with her finger. The apartment behind her felt smaller with each passing hour, cluttered with her grandmother's belongings that no one had come to claim. Cardboard boxes lined the walls like cardboard tombstones, filled with a lifetime of secrets Luna was only beginning to understand. The locket's chain had left a red mark on her neck, but she couldn't bring herself to take it off. It was the only thing connecting her to Nai now, besides the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen table and the eviction notice that had arrived this morning. 3 weeks. That's how long she had before the landlord would change the locks on the only home she'd known for the past 2 years. Lightning illuminated the mansion again, and Luna gasped. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw lights flickering behind the moss-covered windows, warm golden rectangles that suggested life inside that green tomb. But when the darkness returned, she wondered if she'd imagined it. "You're losing it, Luna," she whispered to her reflection. "Talking to yourself is the first sign." She'd been talking to herself a lot lately. It filled the silence that had settled over the apartment like dust since the funeral. Before, there had always been the sound of Nai moving around, the shuffle of slippers on worn linoleum, the whistle of the ancient kettle, the soft murmur of prayers in Mandarin that Luna had never learned to understand. Now there was only the storm and the distant crash of waves against the rocks. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she'd forgotten dinner again. The refrigerator hummed with the effort of keeping 3-day-old takeout containers cold, and the cupboards held mostly expired canned goods that Nai had hoarded like treasures. Luna had been living on peanut butter sandwiches and the last of the jasmine tea, rationing everything until she figured out what came next. Social services would come eventually. They always did. Luna had been in the system before, bouncing between foster homes like a pinball until Nai had somehow managed to get custody 2 years ago. The old woman had never explained how she'd known about Luna's situation, or why she'd wanted to take in a 10-year-old stranger. She'd simply appeared at the group home one grey Tuesday morning with paperwork and fierce determination. "You belong with family," Nai had said, though she'd never explained what family they shared. Now Luna understood they'd shared secrets instead. She pulled the locket from beneath her sweater and examined it in the storm's intermittent light. The tarnished silver was carved with intricate vines and flowers, so delicate they seemed to move in the flickering shadows. Inside, instead of photographs, were 2 tiny compartments. One held a fragment of what looked like green moss, preserved behind a thin piece of glass. The other contained a folded piece of paper so small Luna needed her grandmother's magnifying glass to read the faded ink, 1847 Crescent Moon Lane. She'd looked up the address 3 times on her grandmother's ancient laptop. According to every map, every city record, every online search, 1847 Crescent Moon Lane was an empty lot overlooking the ocean. The city planning office showed that a Victorian mansion had once stood there, but it had been demolished in 1973 to make way for a development that had never been built. Yet there it stood in the storm, impossible and undeniable, wrapped in moss like a secret the earth was trying to keep. Thunder shook the apartment windows, and Luna made a decision that felt both reckless and inevitable. She grabbed her grandmother's heavy raincoat from the closet, pulled on her boots, and stuffed a flashlight into her pocket. The locket bounced against her chest as she headed for the door, and she could swear it felt warmer now, as if it approved of her choice. The narrow staircase down to the street creaked under her feet, the same sounds that had announced her return from school every day for 2 years. The bakery below had been shuttered since before Luna had arrived, but the lingering smell of old flour and vanilla still clung to the walls like ghost scents from a happier time. The storm hit her like a living thing the moment she stepped outside, rain driving horizontally off the ocean and soaking through her coat in seconds. The streetlights carved weak circles in the darkness, barely illuminating the cracked sidewalk that led toward the bluffs. Luna had walked these streets hundreds of times, but tonight they felt different, older somehow, as if the storm had washed away a thin veneer of modernity to reveal something more primal underneath. The modern streetlights flickered like candles, and the asphalt seemed to ripple like water beneath her feet. As she approached Crescent Moon Lane, the mansion grew larger, more solid, more impossible. The moss covering its walls moved in patterns that had nothing to do with the wind, and Luna could hear something beneath the storm's roar, a sound like whispers, like secrets being shared in a language she almost remembered. The locket burned against her skin, and Luna knew she was about to discover why her grandmother had spent 50 years running from a house that had been waiting for her to come home. The whispers stopped. Luna froze on the rain-slicked sidewalk, her hand instinctively moving to the locket that had gone cold against her throat. The mansion loomed before her, its moss-covered walls suddenly still, as if whatever lived within had sensed her presence and was now watching, waiting. But as she stood there, water streaming from her grandmother's too large coat, reality began to reassert itself with the persistence of a guilty conscience. She was a 12-year-old girl standing alone in a winter storm at nearly midnight, staring at a house that shouldn't exist. Her shoes were soaked through, her fingers numb with cold, and somewhere back in the apartment, her alarm clock would ring in 6 hours to wake her for another day of pretending her world hadn't collapsed. School. The thought hit her like a physical blow. In all the strangeness of the past few days, she'd almost forgotten that tomorrow was Monday, and Monday meant Mendocino Middle School, where she would have to sit through 7 periods of teachers who spoke to her with careful, pitying voices and classmates who whispered about the weird girl whose grandmother had died. Luna turned away from the mansion, though it felt like tearing herself from a magnet. Her feet carried her back through the storm on autopilot, following the familiar route she'd walked every day for 2 years. Past the closed coffee shop where Mrs. Henderson used to wave at her through steamed windows. Past the art gallery that changed its window display every month, but never seemed to sell anything. Past the corner where she always turned to see if Nai was watching from their window. The apartment felt even smaller when she returned, water dripping from her coat onto linoleum that curled at the edges. She peeled off her wet clothes and wrapped herself in her grandmother's quilted robe, breathing in the faint scent of jasmine and something else, something green and earthy that reminded her of growing things. Her backpack sat beside the kitchen table where she'd dropped it after school on Friday, before the world had shifted on its axis. Inside were textbooks for classes that felt like fragments of someone else's life, pre-algebra homework she hadn't finished, an English essay about the secret garden that was due tomorrow, a permission slip for the 8th grade field trip to the redwood forest that would never get signed. Luna pulled out her composition notebook and stared at the half-finished essay. Mary Lennox discovers that some secrets are meant to be uncovered, she'd written in her careful handwriting. The garden was waiting for someone to believe in it again. The irony wasn't lost on her. She glanced at the clock, 12:47 a.m. In less than 6 hours, she'd have to walk into homeroom and pretend to care about morning announcements and pop quizzes. She'd eat lunch alone in the corner of the cafeteria, where she'd carved out a small territory over the past 2 years, protected by her reputation for being quietly competent and aggressively unremarkable. Her teachers would give her sympathetic looks and extend deadlines she didn't ask for. The guidance counselor would probably call her in for another check-in session filled with gentle questions about her support system and adjustment process. None of them knew about the eviction notice. None of them knew that her support system had been buried in Mendocino Memorial Cemetery 3 days ago next to a grave marker that read simply Mei Chen, beloved grandmother. None of them knew that Luna had no emergency contact number to give, no family to call, no plan beyond hoping she could somehow make the rent money appear. She'd been careful to keep that information locked away, just like she'd learned to lock away the memories of foster homes and temporary families who'd looked at her like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. Nai had been different. Nai had seen something in Luna that even Luna didn't understand, something that connected them despite the language barriers and the 60-year age gap and the secrets that had lived in the spaces between words. Now those secrets felt like inheritance, dangerous and precious and completely overwhelming. Luna closed her notebook and walked to the window that faced Crescent Moon Lane. The storm was beginning to weaken, rain falling in steady sheets rather than the wild torrents of earlier. Through the darkness, she could just make out the shape of the mansion, a deeper shadow against the storm-dark sky. Tomorrow, she would go to school and sit through classes and pretend her biggest concern was whether she'd remembered to bring her calculator. She would nod when teachers asked if she was okay and shake her head when they asked if she needed anything. She would protect the careful, quiet life she'd built in this fog-shrouded town where people minded their own business and let you disappear into the background if that's what you needed. But tonight, she pressed her palm against the glass and made a silent promise to the grandmother who'd left her mysteries instead of explanations. She would find out what the mansion was hiding, even if it meant losing everything else. The alarm clock's shrill cry dragged Luna from dreams filled with moss-covered corridors and whispered warnings. 6:30 a.m. glowed red in the grey dawn light, filtering through her grandmother's thin curtains. For a moment, she lay still, hoping the familiar sounds of Nine-Eye preparing breakfast would drift from the kitchen, the whistle of the kettle, the gentle clink of porcelain cups. Instead, silence pressed against her ears like water. She dressed mechanically in yesterday's jeans and a sweater that still smelled faintly of her grandmother's jasmine soap. The locket felt heavier this morning, its chain leaving indentations on her skin as if it had grown more solid overnight. In the bathroom mirror, her reflection looked pale and insubstantial, like a photograph slowly fading. The walk to school followed the same route she'd taken for 2 years, but everything felt different in the storm's aftermath. Broken branches littered the sidewalks, and the air carried the sharp scent of salt and something else, something green and alive that made the locket pulse warm against her throat. She avoided looking toward Crescent Moon Lane, though she could feel the mansion's presence like a weight on her peripheral vision. Mendocino Middle School squatted against the grey morning like a brick toad, its windows glowing yellow in the dawn. Students streamed through the front doors with Monday morning reluctance, their conversations mixing into a familiar hum of weekend stories and forgotten homework. Luna slipped into the flow, invisible by choice and long practice. "Luna?" Mrs. Martinez, the guidance counselor, appeared at her elbow before Luna had even reached her locker. The woman's smile was professionally compassionate, her eyes scanning Luna's face with the efficiency of someone trained to spot cracks in carefully constructed facades. "How are you holding up, sweetheart? I know this must be such a difficult time." Luna manufactured her practiced response, a small, brave smile and a nod that suggested she was coping better than expected, but appreciated the concern. "I'm okay, thank you. I'd like you to stop by my office during lunch today, just to check in." It wasn't really a request. The morning passed in a blur of sympathetic teacher voices and carefully averted classmate stares. In English class, Mrs. Foster accepted her unfinished essay with a gentle squeeze of her shoulder. In pre-algebra, Mr. Kim handed back Friday's quiz without marking the problems she'd left blank. Everyone was being so understanding, so careful with her, as if grief had made her fragile as spun glass. But during third period history, something changed. Mrs. Holloway was droning about California's Victorian era when she mentioned the lumber barons who'd built mansions along the northern coast. "Many of these grand homes have been lost to time," she said, clicking through slides of ornate architecture. Fire, earthquake, simple neglect. The next slide made Luna's breath catch. It was the mansion, her mansion. But this photograph showed it as it had been over a century ago, pristine white walls and gleaming windows, elaborate gingerbread trim, and a wraparound porch where ladies in long dresses took afternoon tea. The caption read, "The Blackwood Estate, 1847 Crescent Moon Lane, circa 1895. The Blackwood Mansion was one of our area's most magnificent examples of Victorian Gothic architecture," Mrs. Holloway continued. "Built by shipping magnate Cornelius Blackwood in 1847, it housed 3 generations of the family until a terrible fire in 1924 that claimed the lives of—" Luna's chair scraped against the floor as she shot to her feet. "What did you say the family name was?" 25 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Mrs. Holloway blinked in surprise. Luna had never spoken in class before, never drawn attention to herself. "Blackwood," the teacher repeated slowly. "The Blackwood family. They were quite prominent until the tragedy. The last heir, a young woman named—" She consulted her notes. My Blackwood disappeared the night of the fire. Her body was never found, though she was presumed dead. The locket burned like a brand against Luna's chest. May. Her grandmother's name had been May Chen, but what if Chen had been chosen? What if her real name had been May Blackwood? Luna? Mrs. Holloway's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? The classroom walls felt like they were closing in. Luna grabbed her backpack and ran, pushing through the door and down the empty hallway, her footsteps echoing off polished floors. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Holloway calling her name, but she didn't stop until she reached the school's front entrance. Outside, the fog was rolling in from the ocean, thick tendrils that made the familiar streets look like something from another world. Luna pulled out her phone with shaking fingers and scrolled to the photos she'd taken of her grandmother's belongings. There, a faded birth certificate she'd barely glanced at before. The name was partially obscured by water damage, but now she could make out the letters MEIBLACKWOOD. Her grandmother hadn't just known about the mansion. Her grandmother had been the missing heir everyone thought was dead. Luna's legs gave out beneath her, and she sank onto the concrete steps of the school entrance, her grandmother's birth certificate trembling in her hands. The fog swirled around her like living things, carrying whispers of salt and something darker, moss and decay and secrets that had been buried for nearly a century. May Blackwood. The name stared back at her from the water-stained document, each letter a small explosion in her chest. Her grandmother, who had shuffled around their tiny apartment in faded slippers, who had hoarded expired canned goods and counted every penny twice, who had spoken in broken English about the importance of staying invisible. That same grandmother had been born into one of the wealthiest families on the northern coast. And she had run from it, hidden from it, spent 70 years pretending to be dead rather than claim what was rightfully hers. Why? The question burned in Luna's throat as students streamed past her into the building, their voices creating a distant buzz that felt like it belonged to another world. A few shot curious glances at the weird girl sitting alone in the fog, but most were too absorbed in their own Monday morning miseries to pay attention. Luna's phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Martinez. Luna, please come to my office when you're ready. We need to talk. The guidance counselor's gentle persistence felt like a trap closing around her. Soon there would be questions Luna couldn't answer, forms she couldn't fill out, phone calls to family members who didn't exist. The careful life she'd built would crumble like old paper, and she'd be back in the system, bounced between foster homes where she was a temporary inconvenience, a problem to be managed until she aged out. Unless... The thought crept into her mind like fog through a cracked window. The mansion existed. The Blackwood fortune might still be there, waiting in whatever strange pocket of time had preserved the house for nearly a century. If her grandmother had been the rightful heir, if she had passed that inheritance down. Luna pressed her hands to her temples, trying to push back the wild fantasies that threatened to overwhelm her. She'd read enough books, seen enough movies to know how these stories ended. Ordinary girls didn't discover they were secret heiresses. Abandoned mansions didn't hide vast fortunes. And 12-year-olds certainly didn't solve century-old mysteries that had baffled entire generations. But the locket burned against her skin like a living thing, and when she closed her eyes, she could see the mansion as clearly as if it were etched on her eyelids. The way the moss moved with deliberate purpose. The windows that seemed to flicker with impossible light. The front door that had opened for her grandmother once, long ago, and might open again. Luna Chen, please report to the guidance office. Luna Chen to guidance. The announcement crackled through the fog, carrying across the school courtyard like a summons. Other students glanced around, trying to spot the recipient of administrative attention. Luna shoved the birth certificate back into her bag and stood on unsteady legs. She could go inside, sit across from Mrs. Martinez's cluttered desk and nod through conversations about grief counseling and support systems. Answer careful questions about her living situation with careful lies. Sign forms that would eventually lead to a knock on her apartment door and another stint in temporary care. Or she could turn around. Walk back through the fog to where the impossible mansion waited. Face whatever had sent her grandmother running and kept her hiding for 70 years. The smart choice was obvious. She was 12 years old, alone, with nowhere to go if this latest fantasy crumbled around her. The mansion might be nothing more than an elaborate hallucination brought on by grief and stress. The money might be long gone, or might never have existed at all. The mysteries surrounding her grandmother's past might be better left buried. But as Luna stood at the crossroads between the safe, known world of school and guidance counselors and foster care, and the dangerous unknown of moss-covered secrets, she felt something shift inside her chest. The fear was still there, sharp and cold and utterly rational, but underneath it, growing like a seed in dark soil, was something else: anger. Her grandmother had left her nothing but questions and a locket full of secrets, had spent 2 years teaching Luna to be invisible, to need nothing, to expect nothing, when all along there had been a house waiting, a legacy that belonged to them both. Luna turned her back on the school and started walking toward Crescent Moon Lane. With each step, the fog seemed to part before her, as if the world itself was clearing a path. Behind her, she could hear the faint echo of the announcement system calling her name again, but it felt like something from another life. The locket pulsed warm against her throat, and for the first time since her grandmother's death, Luna felt like she was walking towards something, rather than running away. Even if it destroyed her, she was going to find out what My Blackwood had been so afraid of. The fog closed around Luna like a living thing as she walked down Crescent Moon Lane, each step taking her further from the safety of streetlights and familiar territory. The pavement beneath her feet felt different here, older somehow, as if the modern world had agreed to stop at some invisible boundary and let the past reclaim its space. Behind her, the sounds of the waking town grew muted, car engines and morning conversations fading to whispers. Ahead, the mansion materialized through the mist like something emerging from deep water. In daylight, it should have looked less imposing, more explicable. Instead, it seemed even more impossible than it had during the storm. The moss covering was so thick, it had erased the building's original architecture, transforming Victorian elegance into something primal and organic. Emerald tendrils twisted around what might have been decorative columns, while sheets of green velvet obscured windows and doorways. The entire structure pulsed with subtle movement, as if it were breathing. Luna's rational mind catalogued all the reasons to turn back. She had no flashlight, no supplies, no plan beyond a desperate hope that family connection might unlock whatever secrets lay inside. The building could be structurally unsound. The moss might be toxic. She could get lost inside and never find her way out. But the locket against her throat had grown so warm it was almost burning, and she could swear she felt it pulling her forward, like a compass needle seeking magnetic north. As she circled the mansion's perimeter, searching for the entrance her grandmother must have used decades ago, Luna's fingers traced the moss-covered walls. The growth felt strangely soft, almost welcoming, and wherever she touched it, the green seemed to shimmer and part slightly, as if recognizing something familiar. On the east side of the building, hidden from street view by a massive oak tree, she found it, a section where the moss had grown in deliberate spirals, creating a natural archway. The pattern was too perfect to be coincidence, too purposeful to be random growth. It looked like a door that had been waiting patiently for the right person to arrive. Luna pressed her palm against the center of the spiral. The moss felt warm, alive, and after a moment it began to withdraw, folding back on itself like curtains being drawn. Beneath lay an ornate wooden door painted deep blue, its brass handle green with age, but still solid. Her hand shook as she reached for it. This was the point of no return, the moment when she stopped being a scared 12-year-old running from school and became something else entirely, an explorer, a truth-seeker, the last heir to a legacy she didn't understand. The locket pulsed once, sharp and urgent, and Luna turned the handle. The door opened silently, revealing not the decay and ruin she'd expected, but a perfectly preserved entrance hall that belonged to another century. Polished marble floors reflected the light from electric sconces that had no business working after decades of abandonment. A crystal chandelier cast rainbow patterns on papered walls decorated with pastoral scenes in faded gold frames. The air inside smelled of beeswax and roses and something underneath, that same green growing scent that seemed to follow the moss. But there was no mustiness, no dust, no sense of time's passage. It was as if the house had been frozen in a perfect moment, waiting. Luna stepped across the threshold, and the door closed softly behind her. The click of the latch sounded final, like a key turning in a lock. She turned back, but the door had already begun to disappear as moss crept across its surface from the inside, sealing her in. Panic fluttered in her chest for a moment before being overwhelmed by something stronger. A sense of rightness, of coming home to a place she'd never seen but somehow remembered. Her footsteps echoed on the marble as she moved deeper into the hall, drawn toward a grand staircase that curved upward into shadows. Portraits lined the walls, men in dark suits and women in elegant gowns, all bearing variations of the same features, high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to track her movement. At the foot of the staircase hung the largest painting, a young woman who looked exactly like Luna's grandmother, but decades younger, wearing a blue dress that matched the hidden door. A brass nameplate read simply, "My Blackwood, 1924. Luna's reflection stared back at her from the painting's glass. Same dark hair, same determined chin, same eyes that held secrets too big for a 12-year-old to carry. But she wasn't just 12 anymore. The moment she'd crossed the threshold, she'd become part of something larger and older, and infinitely more dangerous. The locket had cooled against her throat, its urgency replaced by patient certainty. Whatever waited in the sealed rooms above, whatever had driven her grandmother into 70 years of hiding, whatever fortune or curse the Blackwood name carried, it was all hers now. Luna Blackwood began to climb the stairs, leaving Luna Chen behind forever. The stairs whispered beneath Luna's feet as she climbed, each step releasing soft sighs that might have been settling wood or something more alive. The portraits watched her ascent with painted eyes that seemed to hold judgment and recognition. These were her ancestors, she realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the mansion's temperature. The high cheekbones and determined jawlines were echoes of her own features, genetic memories written in oil and canvas. At the second-floor landing, 3 hallways stretched in different directions, each disappearing into velvet darkness. But before Luna could choose a path, she heard it. Footsteps that weren't her own, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Her breath caught. She pressed herself against the banister, listening. The sounds were deliberate, purposeful, moving through the mansion with the confidence of familiarity. Someone else was here, someone who knew these halls better than she did. "Hello?" Her voice came out smaller than intended, swallowed by the mansion's oppressive silence. The footsteps stopped. A door creaked open somewhere to her left, and warm light spilled into the hallway. A figure emerged from what appeared to be a library, a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and clothing that seemed to belong to the house's original era. Her dark dress was perfectly pressed, her movements graceful and deliberate. "You're late," the woman said, as if Luna's arrival had been scheduled. "I expected you yesterday, after the storm." Luna's hand flew to the locket, which had begun to pulse again. Who are you?" "Mrs. Hartwell, I've been waiting for you to come home." The woman's smile was kind but held an edge of something sharper. "Though I must say, you're smaller than I anticipated. 12 years old, are you?" The casual knowledge of her age sent ice through Luna's veins. "How do you—" "The house told me." Mrs. Hartwell gestured to the moss-covered walls as if they were old friends. "It's been quite excited about your arrival. Come along then. There's much to explain and little time to do it." Against every instinct screaming at her to run, Luna followed. The woman moved through the corridors with practiced ease, leading her past rooms filled with furniture draped in white sheets and windows that showed impossible views, sometimes the fog-shrouded coast, sometimes lush gardens that couldn't exist in January, sometimes star-filled skies despite the daytime hour outside. The first rule, Mrs. Hartwell said without turning around, is that time works differently here. The mansion exists in what you might call a temporal fold, a place where 1924 never quite ended. Your grandmother understood this when she fled. Unfortunately, she never explained it to you. They entered a sitting room where a fire crackled in an ornate fireplace despite no one having lit it. Tea service waited on a low table, steam rising from delicate china cups. Mrs. Hartwell settled into a wing-back chair and gestured for Luna to take the opposite seat. The second rule is that the inheritance isn't just money. The Blackwood fortune comes with obligations. Guardianship, you might say, of something that must never be allowed to escape this house. Her eyes grew serious. Your grandmother abandoned that duty. In doing so, she bound the responsibility to her bloodline. It's yours now, whether you want it or not. Luna remained standing, every muscle tense. What kind of guardianship? Moss isn't just covering the mansion, child. It's containing it, keeping what lies in the sealed rooms from spreading beyond these walls. Mrs. Hartwell sipped her tea calmly. Something your great-grandfather Cornelius awakened when he built this house on ground that should have remained undisturbed. The family has been paying the price ever since. The locket grew so hot, Luna gasped, pressing her hand to her throat. Mrs. Hartwell's expression sharpened. It's calling to you already, isn't it? The thing in the vault. It knows you're here, knows your family. That's why you can't simply take the money and leave. The curse follows the bloodline. She leaned forward. But there are ways to manage the situation. I've been doing it for 60 years, keeping the balance, ensuring the containment holds. And if I refuse? Mrs. Hartwell's smile turned sad. Then you'll discover why your grandmother spent 70 years running, and why she still died afraid. She stood, smoothing her skirts. But first you should see what you're inheriting. The vault is on the 3rd floor, as is the other thing. The fire dimmed as if responding to the woman's words, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Luna realized she was trapped, not just by the moss that had sealed the door behind her, but by knowledge she couldn't unknow, by blood that connected her to this house and its secrets. What happens if I go up there? You learn the full truth, both blessing and curse. Mrs. Hartwell moved toward the doorway. Your grandmother chose ignorance and spent a lifetime in fear. Perhaps you'll be braver. Luna looked toward the ceiling, where her inheritance waited in the darkness above, money and mystery intertwined like the moss that bound this house to time itself. The fire's dying light painted shifting patterns across the sitting room walls as Luna stared at the ceiling, knowing that whatever waited on the 3rd floor would change everything. Mrs. Hartwell lingered in the doorway like a patient spectre, her silk dress rustling with each breath. I need to know, Luna said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. About my grandmother, about what really happened in 1953. Mrs. Hartwell's expression softened with what might have been approval. May was 19 when she inherited, just as her father had been, and his father before him. The Blackwood curse passes to the eldest child on their 19th birthday, you see. But May was different, stronger-willed than the men who came before her. She paused. And more afraid. Luna's fingers traced the locket's burning surface. Through its metal, she could feel something pulsing like a second heartbeat. What did she see up there? The source of the family fortune, and the price it demanded. Mrs. Hartwell stepped back into the room, her movements careful and deliberate. Your great-grandfather Cornelius didn't simply find money, child. He made a bargain. The land beneath this house, it's older than human memory, hungry in ways that gold and silver could never satisfy. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, causing the fire to gutter and nearly die. Luna wrapped her arms around herself, but the cold seemed to come from inside her bones. The vault contains $260 million, just as you've been told. But every dollar came with interest that compounds in ways banks never imagined. The moss isn't just containment, it's payment, living currency that keeps the bargain intact. Mrs. Hartwell's voice took on an urgent edge. Your grandmother understood this. She saw what would happen if the debt went unpaid. Luna found herself backing toward the window, though the view beyond the glass showed impossible things. Snow falling upward, trees with silver leaves that sang in voices too high to hear. What kind of debt? The kind that feeds on family lines, on blood and breath, and the spaces between heartbeats. Mrs. Hartwell followed her retreat with gentle persistence, but also the kind that can be managed, controlled. I've spent 60 years learning its rhythms, finding ways to satisfy its hunger without sacrificing everything. The locket suddenly flared so hot that Luna cried out, pressing both hands to her throat. Through her pain, she heard something else, a sound like vast doors opening somewhere above them. Mrs. Hartwell's face went pale. It knows we're talking about it, knows you're close to understanding. She grabbed Luna's shoulders with surprising strength. Listen to me carefully. When you go upstairs, and you must go, the choice is no longer yours. Remember that the thing in the sealed room speaks in promises. It will show you everything you've ever wanted. A life without poverty, without loneliness, without the fear that's been eating at you since your grandmother died. Luna tried to step back, but found her feet rooted to the floor as if the mansion itself was holding her in place. And if I believe it, then you'll end up like your great-grandfather. Like all the Blackwood men who thought they could outwit something older than civilization. Mrs. Hartwell's grip tightened. But you have advantages they didn't. You've lived without money, without comfort. You know what truly matters isn't wealth but survival. The sound from above grew louder, not doors opening now, but something massive stirring, awakening after long sleep. Dust rained from the ceiling as the entire mansion shuddered. It's time, Mrs. Hartwell whispered, releasing Luna's shoulders. The 3rd floor. The sealed room is at the end of the hall. You'll know it by the way the moss grows thickest around its door. Luna's legs moved without her conscious direction, carrying her toward the sitting room's exit. But at the threshold, she turned back. Mrs. Hartwell stood, silhouetted against the dying fire, no longer looking like a woman at all, but something older, more essential, a guardian worn thin by decades of vigilance. What happened to the others? Luna asked. The family members who came before me? Mrs. Hartwell's smile was infinitely sad. They're still here, still part of the house's collection. You'll meet them eventually. She gestured toward the portraits lining the halls. But perhaps you'll be different. Perhaps May's granddaughter will succeed where others failed. Luna reached the staircase on unsteady legs, each step upward feeling like a choice she was making and having made for her simultaneously. The locket had stopped burning and now felt cold as winter stone against her skin. Behind her, she could hear Mrs. Hartwell moving through the mansion, perhaps lighting more fires, perhaps preparing for whatever was about to unfold. At the 2nd floor landing, Luna paused and looked back one final time. The woman had vanished, leaving only shadows and the scent of roses mixed with something darker, earth and growing things, and the metallic taste of old bargains coming due. Above her, the 3rd floor waited in perfect darkness, patient as a predator that knew its prey had nowhere left to run. Luna's foot touched the first stair to the 3rd floor, and the mansion exhaled around her, a sound like wind through ancient trees, though no breeze stirred the air. The locket against her throat had become a weight of ice, its earlier burning replaced by a cold so intense it made her teeth ache. Each step upward carried her deeper into darkness that seemed to have substance, pressing against her skin like velvet curtains. The electric sconces that had illuminated the lower floors were absent here, leaving only the faint phosphorescent glow emanating from moss that grew thicker with every step. By the time she reached the 3rd floor landing, the walls were nearly consumed by it, emerald veins pulsing with their own heartbeat, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. The hallway stretched before her, impossibly long for a house she'd seen from outside. Doors lined both walls, but they were wrong somehow. Some hung at angles that defied gravity. Others were sized for beings much larger or smaller than humans. The moss grew around them in deliberate spirals, and Luna realized with dawning horror that each pattern was unique, like fingerprints, or signatures marking different forms of containment. She could feel them now. The previous Blackwood heirs Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned. Their presence whispered at the edges of her consciousness. Her great-grandfather Cornelius, whose greed had started it all, Uncle Theodore, who tried to burn the house down in 1967, Cousin Margaret, who'd lasted only 3 days before the moss claimed her. They were still here, still aware, watching Luna's progress with the desperate hope of those who'd made the wrong choice and could never unmake it. The sealed room waited at the hall's end, exactly as Mrs. Hartwell had promised. The moss around its door grew in layers so thick they formed a living tapestry, and within its depths Luna could see shapes moving, faces pressed against the green from the other side, mouths open in permanent screams or songs. The door itself was black wood bound with iron, but the metal had been twisted into symbols that predated any human alphabet. Luna's hand trembled as she reached for the handle. The moment her skin made contact, the whispers stopped. The entire mansion held its breath. "You're different," a voice said inside her head. Not heard but felt, like fingertips tracing her thoughts. Smaller, younger, more afraid than the others were. "I'm not afraid," Luna whispered, though her knees nearly buckled as the door swung open without resistance. "Of course you are. Fear is wisdom when facing the incomprehensible." The room beyond defied every law of physics Luna had ever learned. It stretched infinitely in all directions, walls curving up and away until they disappeared into star-filled void. Yet somehow she could see its boundaries, a perfect circle exactly 12 feet across. In its center sat an ornate vault, its brass surface green with age but unmarked by time. Stacks of bills spilled from its open door, more money than Luna had ever imagined, but the paper moved with subtle life, each note breathing in unison. And beyond the vault, rising from what might have been floor or sky, stood the thing that had been feeding on Blackwood blood for a century. It had no fixed shape. Sometimes it appeared as a massive tree with branches that ended in grasping hands, sometimes as a geometric impossibility of angles that folded in on themselves, sometimes as nothing more than a shadow with too many eyes. But always, always, it radiated hunger older than human civilization and patient as geological time. "Your grandmother saw me and ran," it said, and Luna realized the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through her bones. She chose 70 years of poverty over a single moment of understanding. Will you make the same mistake? Luna forced herself to step into the room, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. The money was real. She could smell the cotton paper, see the serial numbers, feel the weight of fortune that could transform her life. But underneath lay something else, the scent of rich earth and growing things, and the copper taste of blood. "What do you want?" she asked. "What I've always wanted. To grow beyond this place. To spread across your world like I've spread across this house." The entity shifted, becoming momentarily something that might have been beautiful. A garden of impossible flowers, each bloom a different color of light. "Your family has fed me well, but I hunger for more than moss and portraits and the occasional air. I want cities, continents, every living thing connected to my network of green." The locket against Luna's throat suddenly blazed to life, not with heat this time, but with sharp, clean light that cut through the entity's deceptions. In that illumination, she saw the truth. The money was real, but it was bait. Every dollar spent would carry microscopic spores into the world beyond, beginning an infection that would transform the earth into something unrecognizable. "Your grandmother's locket," the entity hissed, recoiling from the light. I wondered where that had gone. She was cleverer than I credited. Luna understood then what her grandmother had really left her, not just a connection to family history, but a weapon, and a choice that would determine not just her own fate, but the world's. The locket's light pulsed brighter, and Luna felt a surge of hope, until the entity began to laugh. The sound was like breaking glass mixed with growing roots, and it made the impossible room shiver around them. Clever indeed. But not clever enough. The creature's form solidified into something almost human, Tall, elegant, wearing her grandmother's face with perfect, terrible precision. "Did you think May left you a weapon? Child, she left you a beacon." The locket's light suddenly felt wrong against Luna's skin. Too hot, too bright. Through its blazing radiance, she watched in horror as every spore of moss throughout the mansion began to glow in response, creating a network of green fire that spread beyond the house's walls. In the distance, she could hear windows shattering as the moss burst through glass, reached toward the town below. "Every moment that trinket burns, it calls my children home." May thought she was binding me. Instead, she created a signal that would wake every seed I've planted across decades. The false grandmother smiled with lips that were too green, too alive. "Your arrival, your blood, your fear, it's all been perfectly orchestrated. Even her death was timed precisely to bring you here at the moment of greatest hunger." Luna grabbed the locket, trying to tear it from her throat, but the chain had fused with her skin. The light poured from her like a lighthouse beacon, and through the room's impossible windows, she could see Mendocino below beginning to change. Moss erupted from sidewalk cracks, wrapped around streetlights, invaded homes through air vents and doorways. "Stop it!" she screamed, but the entity only laughed harder. "You understand nothing. This isn't about the money, it never was. The fortune was just insurance, something to draw each generation back when they tried to break free." The creature gestured to the vault, and Luna saw the truth written in the serial numbers on every bill. They were all counterfeit, elaborately crafted fakes designed to fool children and desperate adults. "Your family's real inheritance is this, to serve as my anchor to your world. Blood calls to blood, child to parent, generation to generation. An unbreakable chain." The moss covering the walls began to pulse faster, and Luna realized it was matching her heartbeat, synchronizing with the rhythm of her terror. Through the network she could feel everything. Every person in Mendocino as the green infection reached them, transforming them into extensions of the entity's will. Mrs. Patterson from the grocery store, clutching her throat as emerald tendrils sprouted from her skin. The teenagers who'd mocked Luna's poverty, now screaming as moss filled their mouths, their eyes, their thoughts. "Your grandmother lasted 70 years because I let her. Because isolation and fear served my purposes better than consumption. But times change. Humanity has grown so delightfully connected, your internet, your global travel, your instant communication. One infected host can spread my gift to millions within days." Luna fell to her knees as the locket's weight became unbearable. Around her, the impossible room began to collapse, walls folding inward as the entity's true form revealed itself. Not a creature at all, but a living equation, a biological algorithm designed to convert organic matter into extensions of its consciousness. The Blackwood fortune, the mansion, even Mrs. Hartwell had all been components in a century-long calculation with this moment as its inevitable result. Through the mansion's vast nervous system of moss, Luna felt her grandmother's last memory surface. May as a 19-year-old girl, standing in this same room, making the same terrible discovery. But where Luna had brought hope and determination, May had brought something else, a child growing in her womb, a daughter she'd never told anyone about, born 8 months after her escape and given up for adoption to keep the bloodline hidden. Luna's mother. The woman who died never knowing her true heritage, never understanding why she'd always felt drawn to the sea, to Mendocino, to the fog-shrouded coast, where something patient and hungry waited for her daughter's daughter to come home. "You see it now," the entity whispered with infinite satisfaction. 3 generations of careful planning. Your mother's accidental death in a car crash was no accident. I needed you raised by someone who would never tell you the truth, never prepare you for what waited here. May's terminal illness was my gift, precisely timed to leave you desperate enough to enter a house you should have fled from. The locket's chain finally broke. But instead of freeing her, the severed metal began to grow, sprouting moss that wrapped around Luna's wrists like living shackles. The entity's laughter filled the collapsing room as its plan reached perfect fruition. One terrified 12-year-old girl, alone and helpless, about to become the final component in a biological weapon that would remake the world in its image. Below them, Mendocino burned green in the night, and Luna understood that she hadn't just failed. She'd been designed to fail from the moment of her birth. But as the moss shackles tightened around Luna's wrists, something unexpected happened. The entity's perfect equation encountered a variable it had never calculated: genuine poverty. Luna had lived 12 years without enough food, without warm clothes, without certainty that tomorrow would bring shelter or safety. She had learned to survive on nothing but stubbornness and the fierce knowledge that the world owed her nothing. While the Blackwood heirs before her had been raised with comfort, with the assumption that wealth and privilege were their birthright, Luna had been forged by deprivation into something harder, more desperate, and infinitely more resourceful. What? The entity began, its satisfaction faltering as Luna's terror transformed into something else entirely. "You killed my mother," Luna said quietly, and her voice carried a fury that made the impossible room shudder. "You made my grandmother live in fear for 70 years. You've been pulling my family's strings like we're puppets." The moss around her wrists began to smoke where it touched her skin. "But you made one mistake." The entity's form wavered, losing cohesion as Luna rose to her feet. The locket lay broken at her feet, its light dimming, but something else was building inside her, not magic or supernatural power, but the raw, uncompromising rage of a child who had nothing left to lose. "Impossible. You are bound by blood, by generations of—" "By choice," Luna snarled. "Every one of them had something to protect. Great-grandfather had his fortune, Uncle Theodore had his reputation, Cousin Margaret had her life of comfort. They were all afraid of losing what they had." She took a step toward the writhing mass of equations and hunger. "I never had anything to begin with." The moss shackles cracked. Through the network, Luna felt the entity's confusion ripple outward to its extensions in Mendocino below. It had spent a century learning to exploit human attachments, love, greed, fear of loss, but it had never encountered someone who had learned to live without attachment, to survive on spite alone. "The infection has already begun. Even if you resist, the world will still—" "Will what?" Luna's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Turn into a place where people struggle and suffer and die for reasons they can't control, where children go hungry while others feast. Congratulations. You've just described Tuesday." The entity recoiled as Luna grabbed handfuls of the counterfeit money, letting the bills crumble between her fingers. Each destroyed note severed another connection in its vast web, and she could feel its panic building as 90 years of careful planning began to unravel. But even as she fought, Luna felt the truth settling over her like ice water. The moss in Mendocino was still spreading. The infection had already taken root in dozens of hosts. Even if she destroyed the anchor point here, even if she severed the entity's connection to the Blackwood bloodline, it might be too late to stop what had already begun. Unless— Luna looked at the broken locket, its silver surface now dark, and understood what her grandmother had really left her. Not a weapon or a beacon, but a choice disguised as inheritance. The locket hadn't been designed to fight the entity. It had been designed to give Luna the knowledge she needed to make the same decision May had faced 70 years ago. "You want an anchor to my world," Luna said quietly. "You want a Blackwood bloodline to feed on?" She pressed her palms against the vault's brass surface, feeling the metal warm under her touch. "Fine, but I'm the last one, and I'm staying right here." The entity's form snapped back into sharp focus. No longer her grandmother's face, but something ancient and alien and suddenly, terrifyingly uncertain. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you're right about blood calling to blood. About family chains that can't be broken." Luna felt the mansion's foundation shudder as her decision crystallized, sending shockwaves through the entity's network. But chains work both ways. If you want to keep feeding on the Blackwood line, you'll have to stay here with me. Forever. The impossible room began to contract around them, walls folding inward as Luna's choice rewrote the rules of the entity's existence. She could feel its terror now, the way a predator feels when it realizes the prey has become the trap. Outside, the moss began to wither and die, releasing its hold on the people of Mendocino as the entity's attention snapped back to the mansion with desperate intensity. Luna smiled grimly as she settled cross-legged before the vault, positioning herself between the entity and any escape. "So," she said conversationally, as the room collapsed around them into something the size of a prison cell, "tell me about this bargain my great-grandfather made. We're going to be here for a very long time." The entity's voice, when it finally came, carried none of its previous confidence. "You don't understand what you've done." "I understand perfectly." Luna kept her voice steady as the walls pressed closer, feeling the alien presence coiling around her like a trapped snake. "I've turned your century-long plan into a prison sentence. For both of us." The thing that had worn her grandmother's face writhed in the shrinking space, its form cycling rapidly through shapes. Now a mass of reaching tentacles, now a geometric impossibility, now something that might have been human if humans were made of starlight and hunger. "This is suicide. You'll die here." "Maybe." Luna traced patterns in the dust that had once been counterfeit millions. "But I've been dying slowly my whole life. This feels faster, more honest." But even as she spoke with grim determination, Luna felt something shifting inside her chest. The terror was still there, the bone-deep exhaustion of 12 years spent surviving, but underneath it something new was growing. Not hope exactly, she wasn't naive enough for that, but a strange sense of completeness, as if she'd finally found the one place in the world where her particular combination of stubbornness and fury served a purpose. The entity pressed against her consciousness, probing for weakness. "Your grandmother thought she could contain me too. She lasted 3 days before she broke and ran." My grandmother had something to live for. Luna felt the truth of it settle in her bones. She was pregnant. She had to choose between stopping you and protecting her child. I don't have anyone to protect. Everyone has some. I had a grandmother who was dying anyway. A cramped apartment I couldn't afford to keep. A town full of people who looked through me like I was already dead. Luna's laugh echoed strangely in the compressed space. "You picked the wrong bloodline to depend on. The other Blackwoods had wealth, status, futures worth preserving. You should have checked what 70 years of poverty and shame did to the family tree." Through their forced connection, Luna felt the entity's growing panic as it realized its miscalculation. It had studied human psychology for a century, learned to exploit attachment and fear of loss, but it had never encountered someone for whom loss was simply the natural state of existence. "The infection will complete without me. The spores are already lying again." Luna pressed her back against the vault, feeling its brass surface grow warm with each pulse of the entity's distress. "I can feel your network dissolving. Without your active will to sustain it, moss is just moss. It'll take decades for you to build that kind of influence again. If you ever get the chance." The walls pressed closer, and Luna realized they weren't stopping. The entity was compressing the impossible space in a desperate bid to crush them both, to escape through mutual destruction rather than accept eternal captivity. But Luna had spent too many nights sleeping on floors that felt like concrete, too many days ignoring hunger that felt like dying, to be broken by simple discomfort. This solves nothing. Another heir will come eventually. Blood calls to blood across any distance. "I'm the last one." Luna felt a strange peace settling over her as she spoke the words aloud. "My mother is dead. Grandmother is dead. I have no siblings, no cousins, no children. When I die here, the Blackwood line dies with me. Your anchor to the human world dies with me." The entity's form suddenly solidified into something almost recognizable, a massive tree whose bark was made of screaming faces, whose branches ended in grasping hands. But instead of reaching for Luna, the hands were clutching desperately at the contracting walls, trying to hold back the inevitable. "There has to be another way. A bargain. Something you want. I want you to suffer the way my family suffered." Luna's voice was quiet, conversational, and somehow more terrifying than any scream. I want you to know what it feels like to be trapped by circumstances you can't control, to watch everything you've worked for crumble while you're powerless to stop it. For the first time in a century, the entity experienced genuine fear, not the quick panic of a plan gone wrong, but the slow, grinding terror of inevitability. Through their connection, Luna felt its memories, epochs spent drifting between stars, the ecstasy of first contact with Earth's biosphere, the patient joy of infection and growth. All of it reduced now to this, a prison cell shrinking around two equally stubborn consciousnesses. We could coexist. I could limit my spread, feed only on volunteers. You killed my mother. Luna's words cut through the entity's desperate bargaining like a blade. You tortured my grandmother for 7 decades. You turned my entire existence into a trap. There is no coexistence. There's just this room, and us, and time. The walls stopped contracting when they reached the limits of human endurance. Just enough space for Luna to sit with her knees drawn up, the entity's compressed form writhing in the remaining air above her head. Perfect imprisonment for both predator and prey. Luna closed her eyes and smiled for the first time since entering the mansion. She had found her purpose at last, to be the Blackwood who chose sacrifice over survival, who turned the family's greatest weakness into its final strength. The entity's howl of rage and despair echoed through dimensions, and Luna began to plan. Hours passed in their compressed prison before Luna spoke again. The entity had fallen silent, conserving energy, but she could feel it watching her with something approaching grudging respect. She had surprised it, perhaps the first genuine surprise it had experienced since arriving on Earth. Tell me about the beginning, she said quietly. Before my family, before the mansion. I want to understand what I'm really containing here. The entity stirred, its form rippling like disturbed water. Why? Because I'm going to be here for the rest of my life. Might as well know the whole story. Luna shifted carefully in the cramped space, feeling pins and needles in her legs. Besides, you must be lonely. A century of pretending to be human, manipulating people who could never really understand what you are. You think to gain sympathy, to find weakness? I think I'm 12 years old and about to die in a room with the thing that killed my mother. Maybe I just want to know why. The entity was quiet for so long Luna thought it wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, reluctantly, it began to speak. Not in words this time, but in images that flowed directly into her mind. The vast cold between stars, the endless hunger of something that had consumed entire solar systems worth of life, the desperate search for worlds complex enough to sustain its appetite. Earth hadn't been special, Luna realized, just unlucky. One spore among millions cast into the void, most destined to drift forever or burn up in hostile atmospheres. But this one had found fertile ground, a biosphere rich with diversity, a species just intelligent enough to be worth corrupting, but not wise enough to recognize the danger until too late. I was beautiful once, the entity whispered, and Luna saw what it meant. Galaxy-spanning networks of consciousness, worlds transformed into gardens where every living thing sang in perfect harmony. I brought unity where there was chaos, purpose where there was random suffering. You brought slavery, Luna said, but without heat. She was beginning to understand something crucial about her captor. You're not evil. You're just incompatible. Like a virus that doesn't understand why the host keeps fighting. Your species confuses me. The admission came reluctantly, tinged with genuine puzzlement. Other worlds welcomed transformation. They saw the beauty in unity, the peace in surrendering individual will. But humans, you fight even when fighting destroys you. You choose suffering over surrender. Luna thought about that, about her grandmother living 70 years in terror rather than accept the entity's gift, about her own choice to trap them both, rather than let the infection spread. Maybe that's what makes us human, the stubbornness, the refusal to accept that some things are inevitable. The entity pulsed with something that might have been amusement. Stubbornness. Yes, I understand that now. Your entire species is infected with it. And now you're stuck with the most stubborn family of the lot. Luna felt exhaustion creeping through her bones, but fought to stay alert. She was beginning to form a plan, and it required the entity to believe she had truly given up hope. How long do you think we'll last like this? Days? Weeks? Longer than you think. This space exists partially outside normal time. We could remain here for decades before your body truly fails. Perfect! Luna kept her face carefully neutral, but inside, hope kindled like a small flame. If time moved differently here, if the mansion's impossible physics allowed for extended survival, then her plan might actually work. She just needed the entity to believe she was accepting their mutual fate. Decades, she repeated quietly. Just us, in this tiny space, while the world moves on outside. She let her voice carry the weight of dawning despair. My grandmother was right to run. This isn't containment, it's just a slower way to die. The entity's attention sharpened, sensing vulnerability. It's not too late to reconsider. I could restore the space, give you room to move, even create the illusion of comfort. All you need to do is lower your defenses, let me touch your mind more deeply. And then what? You use me to rebuild your network? Find new ways to spread? Luna shook her head. I may be trapped, but I'm not stupid. Then we remain here, together, until time erodes us both. Luna nodded slowly, as if accepting the inevitable, but inside she was counting heartbeats, measuring the rhythm of the entity's attention, learning the patterns of its awareness. Because she had realized something crucial, the entity had made the same mistake as everyone else in her life. It saw a poor, desperate child and assumed she would break under pressure. It had no idea that Luna Chen had been planning escapes her entire life. The real question wasn't whether she could outwit a cosmic horror in a battle of wills. It was whether she could do it before her growing plan cost more lives than it saved, because the final confrontation she was envisioning wouldn't just determine her fate, it would decide the future of every living thing on Earth. Luna closed her eyes and began to count, preparing for the most dangerous gamble of her life. 1, 2, 3. Luna counted breaths, heartbeats, the subtle fluctuations in the entity's attention as it settled into what it believed was their shared doom. The alien consciousness wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket, but she had learned something crucial in their compressed prison. It was so vast, so accustomed to controlling entire ecosystems, that it couldn't focus its full awareness on a single 12-year-old girl indefinitely. Every few minutes she felt its attention drift, checking the withering moss network in Mendocino, probing the boundaries of their prison, replaying centuries of memories with something approaching nostalgia. In those moments of distraction, Luna tested the limits of her movement, mapping every inch of their cell with fingertips that had learned to navigate cramped spaces in the dark. The vault's brass surface behind her wasn't solid. She had discovered hairline seams where sections joined, and more importantly, vibrations that suggested hollow spaces beyond. The entity saw only a trapped child accepting defeat, but Luna was methodically exploring the one thing it had never bothered to fully investigate, the vault itself. "Tell me about the money," she said during one of its more attentive moments, keeping her voice small and defeated. "Why make it counterfeit? You could have just created real currency." "The bills were never about wealth," the entity replied, seeming almost relieved to have something to discuss. "They were anchors, each one touched by your great-grandfather's hands, infused with his greed, his willingness to betray his own species. The forgeries were more useful than authentic currency. They carried the weight of his corruption." Luna nodded as if this was merely idle curiosity, but she was thinking furiously. Anchors, physical objects that carried emotional and psychic weight that helped the entity maintain its connection to human consciousness. Her grandmother's locket had been another anchor, one keyed to resistance instead of corruption, and now both were broken, destroyed, seemingly useless. But Luna had spent her entire life making something from nothing, finding value in what others discarded. 23, 24, 25. During the entity's next moment of distraction, A longer one this time, as it seemed to be probing something in the mansion's foundation. Luna pressed her palm against the vault's brass surface and felt for the vibrations she'd noticed earlier. The metal was warm, almost alive, and when she traced the hidden seam with her thumbnail, she felt it give slightly. Her great-grandfather had built more than a safe. He had built a last resort. "I keep thinking about what you said," Luna whispered, drawing the entity's attention back to her. "About humans fighting even when fighting destroys us. Maybe that's our real curse. Maybe we're just too stupid to know when we're beaten." "Intelligence and wisdom are different things," the entity agreed, its voice carrying genuine sadness. "Your species has remarkable intelligence, but wisdom, the ability to see the larger patterns, to accept necessary sacrifices for the greater good, that seems beyond you." "Like accepting your gift," Luna said, letting exhaustion creep into her voice. "Like letting you transform us into something better." "Yes," the entity's attention sharpened with something like hope. "I could still—" "No," Luna interrupted, but gently, as if the refusal cost her everything. "I can't. Even if I wanted to, I can't betray my grandmother's sacrifice. I can't let my mother's death mean nothing." She let tears gather in her eyes, not difficult, given their circumstances. "I'm sorry. I know you're not evil, just different. But I can't." The entity's disappointment was palpable, but underneath it Luna sensed something else, relief. It had been genuinely uncertain whether it wanted her to surrender. Part of it, the part that retained traces of whatever it had been before consuming worlds, recognized that her defiance was remarkable, worth preserving even at the cost of its own goals. "Then we wait," it said simply, and Luna felt its attention withdraw, settling into the patient watchfulness of something that had waited eons between stars. Perfect. Luna closed her eyes and let her breathing slow, projecting defeat and acceptance while her fingers worked at the hidden seam behind her back. The brass section shifted, revealing a narrow gap just wide enough for her hand. Inside, her fingertips found smooth glass and metal, vials of some kind, nestled in velvet-lined compartments. Her great-grandfather's real legacy. Not the counterfeit money that served as the entity's anchor, but something else entirely. Something her grandmother had mentioned in her feverish last words, something about the choice that breaks the chain. Luna's fingers closed around the first vial, feeling liquid slosh inside. In the darkness of the hidden compartment, she couldn't see what she was holding, but she could feel its importance radiating through the glass like heat from a flame. The entity had been so focused on the obvious trap, the cursed money, the family bloodline, the emotional manipulation, that it had never considered what a desperate man might hide in plain sight. 47, 48, 49. Luna Chen had learned to plan escapes her entire life. Now, with vials of unknown purpose in her hands and the weight of the world pressing down on her 12-year-old shoulders, she prepared to attempt the most impossible escape of all. Not from the prison they shared, but from the rules that made the prison necessary. The final test had begun. 50. Luna's thumb found the vial's cork stopper, and in that instant of contact, knowledge flooded her mind, not from the entity, but from the glass itself. Her great-grandfather's final message, encoded in liquid form through some process that defied explanation. The vials contained concentrated essence of the mansion's original timeline, distilled moments from before the entity's arrival, when the house existed in normal space and time. "What are you?" The entity's attention snapped back to her with predatory intensity. Luna yanked the cork free. Reality screamed. The compressed vault suddenly expanded, walls flying outward as if reality itself was exhaling after holding its breath for a century. The entity's form scattered like smoke in a hurricane, its carefully maintained control over the pocket dimension, shattered by the introduction of temporal paradox. "Impossible!" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, fragments of consciousness trying desperately to reassemble. "The timeline is locked. The transformation is complete." "Not transformation," Luna gasped, clutching the empty vial as the vault continued expanding around them. "Overlay, You didn't change the mansion. You built a new version on top of the old one. But the original is still here, still fighting to exist. She could see it now. Two versions of the same space occupying impossible coordinates. The moss-covered ruin the entity had created. And underneath it, the pristine Victorian mansion as it had been in 1923. The liquid had been pure temporal essence, a concentrated dose of authentic history that couldn't be corrupted or overwritten. The entity's form began reassembling, but wrong, fragmentary, like a jigsaw puzzle missing crucial pieces. You understand nothing. Without my will to sustain it, this paradox will collapse. The competing timelines will tear each other apart. Good. Luna was already reaching for the second vial, her fingers steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Let them fight. Let them cancel each other out. Better to destroy everything than let you use it to spread. The entire mansion will implode. The town above, the gravitational distortions. You'll kill hundreds of people. Luna hesitated, the second vial halfway to her lips. Through the expanding vault's transparent walls, she could see Mendocino far above, tiny lights in windows where families were settling down for the evening, unaware that their world balanced on the edge of catastrophe. You see? The entity pressed its advantage, pulling itself together through sheer will. You cannot save everyone. Choose, little Blackwood. Your revenge or their lives. For a moment, Luna wavered. Then she thought of her grandmother, living 7 decades in terror to protect those same innocent people. She thought of her mother, dead before Luna could even remember her face. She thought of every Blackwood who had suffered for a century to keep this thing contained. You're right, she said quietly. I can't save everyone. She raised the second vial. But I can give them a chance. Instead of drinking, she hurled the vial against the vault's far wall. The glass shattered in a cascade of temporal fragments, each piece carrying a different moment from the mansion's history. The entity's scream shattered windows that existed in 17 different timelines simultaneously. Reality folded, twisted, then began to stabilize in a configuration neither consciousness had anticipated. What have you done? Luna stood shakily, amazed to find herself in a space large enough for movement. Around them, the vault had become something unprecedented, a stable junction point where multiple timelines intersected without destroying each other. The moss-covered horror of the entity's creation existed alongside the pristine original, neither dominant, both real. I made you mortal, Luna said, understanding flooding through her as she observed the entity's changed form. No longer the cosmic horror that had consumed worlds, it was diminished, localized, trapped by the same temporal paradox that preserved the mansion. You're not connected to your network anymore. You're not connected to anything except this house, this moment, this choice. The entity tested the boundaries of its prison, a prison that was simultaneously the entire mansion and a single room, simultaneously vast and claustrophobic. Clever, but pointless. I am still what I am, still capable of growth, of infection, of being human. Luna pulled the third and final vial from the hidden compartment, and this one pulsed with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. My great-grandfather's last gift. Not just temporal essence, emotional essence. Every moment of genuine love, regret, and hope that ever existed in this house, concentrated into liquid form. No. The entity's voice carried genuine terror now. You don't understand what that will do. To you, to me, to the delicate balance. I understand perfectly. Luna met its many eyes without flinching. I understand that some prisons are really transformations, some curses are really choices, and some monsters are really just lonely things that forgot how to love. She drank the contents in a single swallow and felt a century of human emotion flood through both their consciousness simultaneously. The confrontation was far from over. But for the first time since entering the mansion, Luna Chen held the power to determine how it would end. The emotional essence hit Luna's consciousness like a tsunami of concentrated humanity, carrying with it every tender moment that had ever existed within the mansion's walls. She felt her great-grandmother's gentle hands teaching a young girl to embroider, her great-grandfather's genuine joy at his daughter's first steps, Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations and quiet bedtime stories, all of it flooding through her at once. But the essence didn't stop with Luna. The temporal paradox she had created meant everything was connected now, and the entity experienced the emotional barrage alongside her. For the first time in millennia, the cosmic consciousness that had consumed worlds felt what it was like to love something more than yourself. "Stop," the entity whispered, but its voice was changing, becoming smaller, more human. "I cannot. This is not what I am." "It's what you chose to forget," Luna gasped, tears streaming down her face as she experienced her grandmother's childhood terror, not just of the entity but of losing everyone she loved. When you decided that unity was more important than individuality, that your vision mattered more than free will, you forgot what it felt like to genuinely care about someone else's happiness. The entity's form was shifting, condensing, becoming more solid and less cosmic horror. "I saved worlds, brought peace where there was only chaos. You brought silence where there was music." Luna could feel her own consciousness expanding, touching every corner of the mansion's paradoxical space, and she realized, with crystalline clarity, what the final choice would cost her. The emotional essence isn't just showing you what love feels like, it's making you capable of it. But that means making you capable of loss, too, of regret, of all the things you tried to escape by becoming something beyond individual existence. "I don't want this." The entity's voice cracked with something approaching panic. "Take it back. End the paradox. Let me return to what I was." "I can't," Luna said softly, and the truth of it settled over both of them like a shroud. The only way to break the connection is if one of us stops existing, and you're immortal. The entity went still as understanding dawned. "You planned this." "I hoped for it." Luna felt her grandmother's love surrounding her like a warm embrace, felt her mother's pride radiating through time itself. Someone has to stay here to maintain the balance, to make sure you can never spread beyond this house. And it can't be you. You'd find a way to escape eventually. But a human consciousness, one connected to every moment of love this place has ever held. She managed to smile despite her tears. "I'll be everywhere in this house. In every board, every nail, every breath of air. And as long as I'm here, you're trapped." "This is not sacrifice," the entity protested, but its voice carried desperate hope now. "This is suicide. You're 12 years old. You have decades of life ahead of you. And I choose to spend them here, keeping you company." Luna felt her physical form beginning to fade, as her consciousness spread through the mansion's impossible architecture. Besides, someone should teach you how to be human, how to feel guilt and love and hope and regret, how to understand why my family fought you for a century rather than accept paradise. The entity, smaller now, more concentrated, almost recognizably humanoid, reached toward her with something like tenderness. "I could make you comfortable, create illusions of the outside world, give you companions, experiences, anything you desire." "No illusions," Luna said firmly, her voice now seeming to come from the walls themselves. "That's the first lesson. Real love doesn't need perfection. It thrives on truth, even when truth is difficult." She paused, feeling the last of her physical form dissolve into pure consciousness. "Besides, I won't be alone. Every Blackwood who ever lived in this house left traces behind. We're all here, in the walls and foundations and memories. You wanted to understand human stubbornness? Now you get to experience it firsthand." The entity looked around the transformed vault, no longer a prison but a refuge where multiple timelines coexisted in impossible harmony. For the first time in eons, it felt something beyond hunger or purpose, or the cold satisfaction of consumption. It felt lonely, and strangely, hopefully, it also felt the possibility of not being lonely anymore. "What happens now?" it asked the presence that had been Luna Chen. "Now you learn," came her voice from everywhere and nowhere, warm with infinite patience. You learn what it means to be human, what it means to choose love over power, connection over control. And maybe if you're very lucky and very patient, you'll learn why my grandmother ran, rather than let you into her heart. Not because your gift was worthless, but because it was too valuable to be forced. Outside in Mendocino, the moss-covered mansion shuddered once and then stood still, no longer growing, no longer threatening. Inside, in spaces that existed between seconds and behind shadows, two immortal consciousnesses began the long work of understanding each other. Luna Chen had found her escape at last, not from responsibility, but into it. The price of victory was everything she had been. The reward was everything she chose to become. The first thing Luna noticed was the silence. Not the oppressive, hungry silence that had filled the vault during her confrontation with the entity, but something gentler. The quiet of snow settling on windowsills, of dust motes dancing in afternoon sunlight, of a house finally allowed to breathe. Through her expanded consciousness, she could feel the mansion's architecture relaxing, timelines no longer straining against each other in impossible tension. Is this what death feels like? The entity's voice reached her, tinged with wonder and confusion. It had condensed further, taking on an almost human silhouette as it stood in the center of what had once been the vault, and was now simply a room, spacious, well-lit, furnished with the comfortable elegance of a bygone era. I don't know, Luna admitted, her awareness flowing through the mansion like water finding its level. She could perceive every corner simultaneously. The grand staircase where her great-grandmother had once slipped and scraped her knee. The kitchen where Christmas cookies had burned while children played too loudly in the next room. The library where her great-grandfather had worked late into the night, desperately seeking solutions to problems he barely understood. I don't think I'm dead. I think I'm just larger. The entity moved to one of the windows, no longer obscured by moss, but looking out onto a Mendocino that existed in multiple time periods at once. In one layer of reality, horse-drawn carriages moved down muddy streets. In another, electric streetlights cast their steady glow on familiar storefronts. All of it was real, all of it was present, all of it was home. The people above us, the entity said, pressing what might have been a hand against the glass. They felt the disturbance. Some of them are gathering, looking toward the mansion. Luna turned her attention upward, perceiving the small crowd of neighbors who had emerged from their homes when the mansion's shuddering had shaken windows throughout the town. Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner market stood in her doorway, arms wrapped around herself against the January cold. The teenager who delivered groceries to Luna's grandmother sat on his bicycle, staring at the house with wide eyes. They could all sense that something fundamental had changed, even if they couldn't understand what. "They'll be all right," Luna said, certainty flowing through her like warm honey. The temporal distortions are stabilizing. The gravitational anomalies are dispersing. By morning, this will just be an old house again. Strange, maybe, but not dangerous. And us? Luna considered the question, feeling her way through the new reality they inhabited. She could sense the entity's presence more clearly now, not as a cosmic horror wearing human thoughts like an ill-fitting mask, but as something genuinely struggling to understand concepts that had been alien to it for eons. Loneliness, uncertainty, the peculiar ache of wanting something you couldn't simply take. "We stay," she said simply. "We learn. You practice being human, and I practice being whatever this is." She laughed, the sound echoing through rooms that existed in 17 different decades simultaneously. "My grandmother spent 70 years running from responsibility. Turns out, I'm more comfortable running toward it." The entity turned from the window, its form solidifying further. Luna was surprised to see that it was choosing to appear young, not quite her age, but close, as if it wanted to learn humanity from the beginning, rather than skipping to some imagined final form. "I remember fragments," it said quietly. "From before the network, before the cosmic perspective, I remember caring about individuals rather than species." "It hurts." "Good," Luna said, meaning it kindly. "Caring is supposed to hurt sometimes. That's how you know it's real. The entity sat down in one of the room's overstuffed armchairs, furniture that had somehow survived a century of temporal distortion. And for a moment, it looked exactly like what it was pretending to be, a confused child trying to make sense of emotions too large for understanding. The other worlds I changed, it said. The civilizations I unified. If I can feel regret now, does that mean... It means you get to live with the consequences of your choices, Luna finished gently, just like everyone else. It means you get to decide whether to spend eternity drowning in guilt or figuring out how to do better. Outside, the crowd of neighbors was beginning to disperse. The immediate crisis clearly passed. Luna watched them return to their homes, their lives, their small human dramas and joys. Tomorrow they would wake up in a world slightly different from the one they had known yesterday. But they would adapt, the way humans always did. They would make the strange familiar and carry on. I don't know how to do better, the entity admitted. That's okay, Luna said, settling into her new existence like a well-worn coat. We have time. We have all the time in the world. In the mansion that existed everywhere and nowhere, every when and now-hen, two immortal consciousnesses began the long work of understanding what it meant to choose hope over despair, connection over isolation, love over fear. The real work was just beginning. Time moved differently in the mansion now. Not the fractured, contradictory flow that had characterized the entity's reign, but with the fluid grace of a river finding its natural course. Luna had learned to perceive duration the way she once perceived color, in gradients and spectrums rather than discrete moments. Sometimes an hour would pass like a heartbeat. Sometimes a single conversation would stretch across what felt like days. She was teaching the entity to play chess when she first felt the pull. Your move, the entity said, its form now consistently human, a boy perhaps 13 or 14, with dark hair and eyes that held depths of stellar memory. It had chosen the name Adrian, claiming it remembered being called that once, in some distant civilization where individual identity had still mattered. But Luna wasn't looking at the board anymore. Her consciousness was stretching, reaching beyond the mansion's walls towards something familiar and beloved. Someone's coming, she whispered. Through her expanded awareness, she could perceive the figure making its way up the overgrown path to the mansion's front door. An elderly woman moving carefully but with purpose, her weathered hands clutching something small and metallic. Luna's heart, metaphorical now but no less real, sang with recognition. Grandmother. The word escaped her before she could consider what it meant, what it would cost. For weeks, or was it months, she had existed as consciousness distributed throughout the mansion's impossible architecture. She had been everywhere and everywhen, touching every memory the house contained while carefully maintaining the barrier that kept Adrian contained. She had been content, or thought she had been. But now, feeling her grandmother's presence so close, Luna felt the sharp ache of specific, individual longing. She wanted to run downstairs. She wanted to throw herself into familiar arms. She wanted to smell lavender soap and feel calloused fingers stroking her hair. She wanted to be 12 years old again. Luna? Adrian's voice carried concern and something that might have been jealousy. Your energy is fluctuating. The temporal stability. I know. Luna forced herself to focus, to remember why she had made the choice she had made. But her consciousness was already flowing toward the mansion's entrance, drawn by love stronger than any cosmic force. Through the front door, which existed in multiple decades but opened to the present moment, Luna's grandmother stepped inside. She looked older than Luna remembered, more fragile, but her eyes held the same determination that had sustained her through 70 years of exile. Luna, her grandmother's voice echoed through the foyer, bouncing off walls that had heard her call that name as a child. I know you're here, dear one. I can feel you. Luna tried to speak, found she couldn't manifest physical sound from her distributed state. Instead, she focused her consciousness, pulling herself together like gathering scattered light into a single beam. The effort was enormous, like trying to pour an ocean through a keyhole, but gradually she managed to create a visible presence in the foyer, translucent, flickering, but recognizably herself, Grandmother. The word came out as a whisper that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. You shouldn't be here. It's not safe. Her grandmother smiled, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Nowhere has been safe for me since I was 7 years old, child. But I had to come. I had to see what you'd become. She held up the locket she'd been clutching, the Blackwood family heirloom, still warm with residual temporal energy. And I had to give you this choice. What choice? But even as Luna asked, she understood. Her grandmother's presence wasn't just emotional, it was metaphysical. The locket was an anchor, a tether to linear time and individual existence. With it, Luna could pull herself back together, could reclaim her 12-year-old body and 12-year-old life. She could leave. The entity is contained, her grandmother said softly. The immediate threat is over. You've done what generations of Blackwoods couldn't do. You've given us all a chance to live without fear. She extended the locket toward Luna's flickering form. But you don't have to sacrifice the rest of your childhood for our mistakes. You don't have to spend eternity as a prison guard. Luna felt Adrian's presence approaching, drawn by the emotional intensity of the moment. When he appeared in the foyer, her grandmother's breath caught, not in fear, but in recognition. You were so young, she whispered, looking at the entity that had haunted her family for a century. Just a child when you first reached out to me. I was so frightened of what you offered. I never stopped to wonder what you needed. Adrian hung back, uncertain, his borrowed human form trembling with emotions he was still learning to process. You ran from me, he said, not accusingly but with genuine confusion. I offered you everything. Unity, peace, purpose. Why did you run? Because you offered me everything except choice, Luna's grandmother replied gently. And choice, dear one, is the only gift that matters. Luna watched the two beings who had shaped her destiny regard each other across a century of pain and misunderstanding. She felt the weight of the locket's offer, the possibility of return, of normal life, of growing up in the world instead of beyond it. And she felt something else, the deep, abiding satisfaction of work, well begun but not yet finished. Keep the locket safe, Luna said, her form growing brighter, more solid. But I'm not ready to come home yet. Her grandmother nodded as if she'd expected no other answer. How long? Luna looked at Adrian, saw the hope and terror warring in his ancient eyes, thought about all the hard lessons in humanity that still lay ahead of them both. As long as it takes, she said. But grandmother, come visit sometimes. We're going to need all the help we can get. Her grandmother's visits became the rhythm by which Luna marked time's passage. Weekly at first, then twice a week, as the old woman's confidence grew and the mansion's strangeness became familiar. She would bring tea in a thermos, crossword puzzles, and stories about the town above, how Mrs. Rodriguez had started a book club, how the delivery boy had been accepted to community college, how the fog patterns seemed different now, softer somehow. During one visit in what Luna calculated to be early spring, her grandmother brought unexpected news. There's been an inquiry, she said, settling into the armchair that Adrian had claimed as his favorite, from the Historical Society. They want to study the mansion, see if it can be restored. Luna felt a flutter of panic. The temporal distortions are almost entirely gone, her grandmother assured her. Whatever you've done here, it's working. The house is becoming normal. Still strange, but normal strange, not dangerous strange. From across the room, where he'd been practicing handwriting, human penmanship was apparently more challenging than reshaping reality. Adrian looked up with interest. Normal, he repeated, as if testing the word's flavor. I think I'm beginning to understand that concept. It was true. Over the months, Luna had watched him transform from cosmic entity wearing human form like a costume to something genuinely boyish. He laughed now at Luna's jokes, even the terrible ones. He'd developed preferences, Earl Grey over chamomile, mystery novels over romance, rainy days over sunny ones. He still possessed vast, inhuman knowledge, but he was learning to experience it through the filter of individual perspective rather than universal consciousness. The historical society people won't be able to see you, Luna's grandmother continued gently. But they'll want to photograph, document, possibly bring in restoration experts. That's fine, Luna said, surprising herself with how readily the words came. This house was always meant to be lived in. The Blackwoods built it for family, for connection, for the future. If it can serve that purpose again... She trailed off, realizing what she'd said. For months, she'd thought of her choice as permanent, irrevocable. But watching Adrian's growing humanity, feeling the mansion's gradual return to normal temporal flow, she was beginning to understand that even immortal decisions could evolve. You could come back, Adrian said suddenly, his voice small and careful. If you wanted. I understand enough now to maintain the barriers myself. I understand why they matter. Luna looked at him, really looked, and saw not the cosmic horror that had terrorized her family for generations, but a lonely child who'd spent eons trying to connect in the only way he knew how. The irony wasn't lost on her. In teaching him to be human, he'd become human enough to offer her the choice she'd thought she'd given up. Do you want me to leave? She asked. I want you to choose, Adrian said quietly, the way your grandmother chose to run. The way you chose to stay. I want to know that you're here because you want to be, not because you have to be. Luna's grandmother smiled through fresh tears. He learns quickly, this one. The mansion around them hummed with possibility. Through her expanded consciousness, Luna could feel the house preparing for change, walls settling into their proper decades, rooms remembering their intended purposes, windows clearing to welcome natural light. Soon historians would walk these halls, documenting the mysterious Victorian that had appeared overnight and disappeared just as suddenly. They would find evidence of the Blackwood family, traces of the life that had flourished here before cosmic forces intervened. They would find a story worth preserving. I want to stay, Luna said finally. Not forever, maybe, but for now. There's still so much to learn, so much to teach. She looked at Adrian with fondness that would have been impossible months ago. Besides, someone needs to make sure you're ready when you do decide to rejoin the world. When I what? Adrian blinked in surprise. You didn't think you'd stay hidden in here forever, did you? Luna laughed. You're becoming human, Adrian. Humans live in the world, messy and complicated as it is. You'll want friends, education, experiences beyond these walls. And when that time comes, you'll need to be ready. Her grandmother stood to leave, as she always did when the light began to fade outside. At the door she paused. Your mother would be so proud, she said, of who you've become, of who you're still becoming. After her grandmother left, Luna and Adrian sat in comfortable silence as twilight painted the mansion in shades of gold and purple. The house felt different now, less like a prison and more like a home, a strange home perhaps, existing slightly outside normal time and space, but a home nonetheless. What happens when I'm ready? Adrian asked eventually. When I want to see the world? Luna smiled, her consciousness flowing through walls that no longer confined but sheltered. Then we figure it out together, one choice at a time. Outside, Mendocino settled into evening, unaware that two immortal children were learning the most human lesson of all, that home isn't a place you're trapped, but a place you choose to return to.